going to crystallize 3 principles of worship. I've already mentioned them in passing, but we're going to deal with them in a little more detail to get them firmly in the mind. 3 principles. There are actually 4, but the 4th I'll deal with a little later on in these addresses. May I say that how we worship is not just a matter of taste. It is certainly not a matter of generation. This is what the advocates of the new worship claim. This is what they say. Oh, those people, referring to traditional, conservative, evangelical worshippers, those people, they don't like what we're doing just on the basis of taste. They don't happen to like it, and they should adjust to it. It's just a matter of taste, is it? Whether you listen in secular life, in your private life, to one kind of music or another, is probably a matter of taste. What you select, what you think is to you pleasant, is that all this is? A matter of taste and a matter of generation? Oh, the old is like this, and the young people prefer that. And therefore the older people are being very mean-spirited if they don't happily embrace the young people and let them do what they want to do. Is that what this is all about? A matter of taste and a matter of generation? No, it isn't. It's a matter of principles. Principles that apply to every age group, every believer. So I come back to these 3 principles, basic principles out of the 6 categories of new worship that I mentioned. And the first is this: spirit and truth has been thrown out and aesthetic worship has come in. Worship with the soul, worship in the spirit has been thrown out, and aesthetic worship has been substituted. This is a principle, you see. Is it what we like? Is it simply that we have a down on certain types of music or activity? No. It's a matter of whether it's spiritual worship or aesthetic worship. Now, aesthetic worship means this. It has to do with worship which is performed by beauty, skill, and offering to God. Aesthetic worship can be according to any taste. We could sit here and regard it as an act of worship by having a concert, by having an organist play a lot of Bach, by having a symphony orchestra in, and listen to this. Lean back, close our eyes, and imagine we're worshipping God. Or we could do it with a pop group or something like that. Is one right and the other wrong? No, they're both wrong. If it is aesthetic worship, if we imagine we are worshipping by making an offering of beauty, the skill of our instrumentality, the cleverness of our musical arrangements, the beauty of the sound, if we think these are an offering of worship, then we have given way to aesthetic worship. As though God was an aesthete, which is to say God was just a lover of earthly beauty, and he sat in the heavens enjoying the concert or the performance that we are putting on. That's aesthetic worship. Now, this used to be, and still is, chiefly adopted by the Church of Rome. The Catholic Church has always had aesthetic worship. They have always said worship needs a physical dimension. And you must be able to express yourself in some physical way and use your gifts. Worship, according to the Church of Rome, is probably 80% wordless offerings. That term, wordless offerings. You worship by skill. There's an Anglo-Catholic hymn. You probably know it. It has these lines in it. Craftsman's art and music's measure, for thy pleasure all combine. That's somebody who believed in aesthetic worship. The act of worship includes the stained glass windows, the soaring nave, the massive stones, the beauty of the vestments. All these things stir us and please God. That's aesthetic worship. Worship by an offering of craft or beauty or skill. The Church of Rome did it with images, with processions, with costly, colourful robes, with rich music, with Gregorian chants. Aesthetic worship. The Protestant Reformation did away with all that. The Protestant Reformation went right back to the New Testament. Away with all those things, said Luther or Calvin. I'm tempted to ask whether the promoters of new worship think that Luther and Calvin in their day and other great reformers were just youngsters who brought in new fashions and new tastes. They were certainly youngsters, but they worked according to principles. They said that is wrong. They saw aesthetic worship as something carnal, and they brought in intelligent worship. And the worship of the people of God was shorn of all the Catholic theatricalism. The giants of the Reformation saw worship in spirit and worship by theatrical performance as exact opposites. Why, one writer, and I like these words, put it very beautifully, one historian, the aesthetically splendid mass surrendered to the understanding soul. That happened at the Reformation. It's a matter of principle. Now, I know that the Episcopalians at the Reformation, the Church of England principally, and one or two other groups, did keep hold of a few bits of Roman Catholic theatre. And that was a shame, but not very much. They kept a few bits. The Anglo-Catholics, who are really same as Roman Catholics within the Church of England, they of course clutch it all back. But even in the English Reformation, a few bits of Roman theatre were kept. But to their credit, they did away with most of it. And then came the nonconformists, the Methodists and the Baptists and the Independents, the Congregationists, and they threw out even the little bit of Roman theatre that the Church of England had kept hold of. So, but by and large, with just a few little bits and pieces on the fringe, the reformers threw out all that Roman theatricalism, did away with it. But now you see, we have made a huge stride back to Rome. As soon as you bring the drums and the instruments in and you play the music and you get the people going in a sensual way, I'm talking about worship. I'm not saying you can't go to a concert of good music and enjoy it and feel moved by it, but that's not the way you worship. You clear the decks and you're all for Jesus Christ. Your mind is clean and clear and your thoughts are for him. Well, friends, now they've made that huge stride back to Rome, because what they do is they bring in the notion I can worship God through my performance, through my instrumentality and all the rest. It's no longer the soaring naves and the stained glass windows and the actions of the priests and the costly garments and the Gregorian chants and so on, but it's a modern equivalent of all that, and we're worshipping, or people are trying to, through it, and they're making their offering. Why, the new worship people even say, God is the audience. Many of their books that I've looked at, they use that kind of language. God is the audience. We're performing for him. That's aesthetic, you see. I worship through skill and through beauty. How has it happened? Well, we talked about the hippies and the new culture that they brought in. We talked about the worldly Christians, the term they gave to themselves extraordinarily. We've talked about the charismatic movement and its delight in all these external things. But there are other things that have brought it in. Just briefly, you know, we've had a phenomenon which is called the church growth movement, where mainly in the United States, a number of people have discovered in that somewhat religious, high religiosity factor society that it's not too hard to get people into church if you entertain them with the kind of things they want. And so instead of preaching the gospel plainly and clearly, and praying to God for his blessing, and witnessing plainly and clearly, the main plank of their outreach, these church growth experts, is to put on the concerts in the services. And they'll give the people anything they want. If they find a particular form of jazz or modern music draws more people in than another form, they'll major on that. The order of the day is just get the people in the seats by giving them whatever pleases them, whatever they want. And because this has become fashionable in some quarters, this has been another impetus to the new worship. It's got to be used in order to entertain the people and to give them the kind of thing they want to come and listen to. That's how it's happened. And now, the new worship has far exceeded Rome. Why, new worship services make far more noise than Rome ever made. More decibels, more music, more entertainment. Even that Rome knew how, and Rome has recognized that. Rome's very clever, the Catholic Church. Just a minute. These people have surpassed us with aesthetic worship. They're doing something much more pleasing. And so, the Catholic churches, by and large, have gone over to it. They've embraced the new worship very eagerly. Why not? Because actually it's only doing in modern form what they've always done. Not surprising, is it? So it's a huge step back to Rome. We think of Cain and Abel. You think of how the one made an offering according to what God required, which reflected the need for atonement and so on. And Cain, the other, made an offering of the produce of the ground. He made an offering of his achievements. And that's what's happening now with new worship. The traditional Protestant Bible worship says only one offering counts. The offering of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. And I must worship with my mind and my heart, holding on to what my mind is thinking and directing to God. And the other side, no, we worship with our skill and our performance. And so, modern worship is like the worship of Cain, not like the worship of Abel. It's as old as the hills. Cain wanted to shine, wanted to show God, look what I can do. That's modern worship. And he was punished for what he did. Sometimes people say to me when I speak like this, but what about my gift? What about my gift? If we have this worship, I agree it can be nice and glorious and wonderful. I can see your point. But how can I express myself through my gift? Well, that's the point. Worship is not the exercise of my gift. It's words from mind and heart to God. It's not the exercise of my gift. That's a great mistake that many make. If I can't express myself with what I can perform and produce, I cannot worship. Wrong. You've got the wrong idea of worship. You come before God as an empty, needy, naked soul. All your performance, that's for your worldly life. All your skills, now you're before God and you worship him from mind and from heart. And anyway, this has always seemed to me to be a bit unfair, this matter of expressing gifts. I want to express my gift with a guitar. I want to express my gift with a trumpet. I want to express my gift with drums. How elitist. Fine, you go ahead and do all those things. What about the poor chap who's gifted only at cricket? Or the lady who's gifted only at basketball? You can't exercise your gifts. What a foolish argument. It's not for the exercise of my gifts. It's for God. And it's to be done with mind and with heart. Well, that is the problem with aesthetic worship. The second great principle, it's got to be spiritual, not aesthetic. The second major principle I single out is this. Worship has got to be rational, not ecstatic. Now I'm repeating myself for the sake of clarity. In truth, with the mind, intelligent, rational worship, not ecstatic worship, just stirring up the feelings by physical, external means. This is a principle. What are you doing in your worship? Oh, say the books on worship from the new worship promoters and leaders. What you do is you have an upbeat opening number, they write. They all write much the same thing. And then you switch the tempo and you have something emotive and searching. Then you up the tempo again, and by the means of the clever arrangement of tempo and key and type and style of music, you bend the emotions, influence the emotions of the people. You sway the feelings, and so by your performance as a group of instrumentalists, you bring people from something enjoyable to get their hearts moving, to something solemn, then through to something suitable for this and suitable for that. You are engineering the mood of the people. That is not what I'm accusing them of, friends. This is the way they write, the way they tell you to do it. It's their own words. This is ecstatic worship. The manipulation, the management of the feelings by physical, carnal, external influences. That's what we mean by ecstatic worship. What do I come to worship for? To be whipped up, to have my feelings stirred, to feel good, to feel euphoria, to feel things. That's why I come. Yes, well, you can have wonderful, wonderful feelings in worship, but they must be feelings which are stirred and moved and produced by our thoughts. That's honouring to God. Lord, I love thee, and the feeling responds. I praise and thank thee, Lord, because my Saviour has come and done this and that, even for a worm such as I am. And my feelings respond. But real worship must be feelings that are attached to those sentiments, those words, not fleshly feelings stirred up by other things. Whether the music is good music, may I use the term, or bad music is almost irrelevant. You mustn't go straight for the feelings. That's ecstatic worship. The Reformers were very clear on this. But now we've gone back to Rome. Rome was always for ecstatic things and manipulation of the feelings. I've written down a little note from the great Puritan Stephen Charnock. Listen to this beautiful 17th century definition of worship. Worship is an act of the understanding, applying itself to the knowledge of the excellency of God, whereby the soul adores and reverences his majesty. Isn't that a beautiful, it's typical Puritan definition, typical Reformers' definition of worship. It's gone, hasn't it, in many circles? It's just been driven underground, and it's gone. We're back to Rome and her smells and bells and performances to stir the senses, to bombard the senses. We're back to that. Why, charismatics tell us they are bored with the old ways. They're bored with them. They're bored with tradition. They've got no taste for that. These hymns are dreadful, dull and boring. People need lively worship. People need things to be strummed up for them. Why are they bored? Why are they bored with beautiful sentiments, reverence, moving things? I don't want to think. Just get me going. I don't want to think. Should that be boring to a believer? Now, I know you can make even a good service boring. It is possible to do that. It is possible for me to lead the worship in a way which is unnecessarily dull. Maybe I pick minor key hymns, one after the other. That's foolishness, because I now am manipulating the people's feelings in another way by pushing them down. Minor key, down, down, one hymn after another, all the way. Yes, I can, in an inverted way, be affecting the emotions of the worship. I can speak in a monotone and at great lengths. Maybe you think I do that. And everything can be dull and boring, and I can impress my dull personality onto the worship and spoil it. So it is true that we can go the other way, and traditional worship can be dull and unworthy. I acknowledge that freely. But on the other hand, if we think about it, and if we bring all the ingredients of worship in, and we use good hymns, why should those sentiments be dull? Why should they bore me to tears? Because I'm unconverted, perhaps. Then they'll bore me to tears. Or because I'm backslidden, perhaps. Then they'll bore me and tire me out. What's the matter with some of our friends? There are many, many good Christians in the charismatic movement, without doubt. But one suspects there are an awful lot who are not really converted. If they find the worship of God and the style and format which has thrilled the souls of millions of Christians around the world for generations, if they find this utterly boring, you wonder where they stand spiritually. Now I know there are many earnest Christians, I don't deny that, among the charismatic. Sometimes a friend will come to our service and ask the vestibule steward, or say to the vestibule steward, I'm used to a more lively service. I find this dull and boring. Now, I'm not saying this simply because I'm irritated by that. But why? Why are they desperately dependent upon external physical means to stir up the feelings? Otherwise, the worship of God is a bore from beginning to end. That's ecstatic worship. Then there's a third principle. These are principles. Why, we could use some test questions. If I hear of a pastor or a church and he's abandoning the old ways and he's brought on the drums and the band and everything, I might say to him, why did you do that? Why did you want more instruments than you were used to? Why did you want the new worship songs? Why did you do it? His answer might give the game away. Supposing his answer is something along these lines. We need to enrich our worship. We need more feeling in our worship. Well, that would give the game away. He's switched from worship which is rational, and he's tumbled into worship which is ecstatic, manipulation of the feelings. That's what's happening. Well, the third principle I'd like briefly to talk about is this. The loss of the distinction between sacred and profane. And this is very important, and they're such familiar terms. I hope everybody can remember this. Worship, traditionally, since the Reformation and back to the Bible, true Christian people have always distinguished between that which is sacred and that which is profane. By profane, we mean this: that which is distinctively worldly, sacred, profane. There's a great gulf between the sacred and the profane. Even the Catholic Church was not totally in error at this point. They went wholesale into aesthetic worship and ecstatic worship, and although there was much irreverence among the priests, when they came to their worship, even the Catholic Church, in all its unregenerate state, realized that it is only logical that the worship of God must be a world on its own. It must be made up of things that are for God, and quite distinct from things that are intrinsically of the world. Even the Catholic Church saw that. Do you know, in this blurring of the line between sacred and profane, which is going on with new worship, importing wholesale all that is worldly, this is something almost novel in 2,000 years of the professing Christian church. Even as far as Rome is concerned, this is how serious the modern collapse of worship is in many circles. Who's to decide what is worldly and what is profane? Who's to decide whether a thing belongs to this world or whether a thing belongs to the church? Is this, after all, just a matter of taste? Oh, you say, that is worldly because you think so. Well, I don't think it is, someone may say. This is just a matter of taste. How can you draw the line? Well, there are certain points where the line may be difficult to draw. But with most of what is going on with the new worship, the line is not difficult to draw. Because to take the popular entertainment idiom of the present day with the rock, pop world and so on, that is obviously worldly for the following reasons. The modern pop scene, however clever it may be, however clearly you may acknowledge that there is obviously a measure of instrumental brilliance involved in it, whether you like it or whether you don't. Obviously, there is considerable skill and brilliance displayed in its musical arrangements and forms. I don't happen to like it, but I acknowledge that there are many capacities and skills involved in it, without doubt. But I say that it is worldly and profane because it is a powerful and determined anti-God culture. Nobody would dispute this. You can point to one or two performers who may themselves try to be different, but as a culture, as an idiom, it is anti-God, and fiercely so. It is anti-moral, and eloquently so. It is anti-authority, anti-God in every sense. It is the supreme anti-God culture. More obviously, determinedly, and powerfully so than any entertainment culture that there has ever been. So that has no place in the worship of God. None whatsoever. Why, if the church has sometimes pinched a tune from classical music, is that worldly? Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because that field or department of classical music may not be anti-God in its image or intent or design at all. Anti-God, anti-morals may not be at all, though there are aspects of classical music that in their lyrics, in their words, of the opera or whatever, may well fit into that category. But there are whole areas of classical music which are in no way to be compared with the anti-God culture of modern pop scene. Now, if somebody liked songs and presentations of modern pop, one is not saying that is a decadent taste, because according to your taste there will be much that is clever, which can be appreciated. But because it is linked with such an anti-God, anti-moral culture, the Christian surrenders it. For most Christians, that's not difficult. For some young Christians, it presents a difficulty, and one has sympathy for that, and understanding for that. But because of its moral associations and its anti-God structure, it's something we have to do. There are things like this throughout the Christian life. There are things we say, that is not for the Christian. It is intrinsically clever, but it's not for the Christian. And even less is it for worship. Why the modern pop culture decries biblical morality and its stars, and it flaunts the opposite in so many of the lyrics. It promotes the alternative society of free sex and so on. It promotes the worship of myself and my lusts as normal, reasonable living. It has an undisputed standing even in the mind of the general public, who accept it as being anti-God, anti-moral, has no place whatever in Christian worship. We say that it is therefore sinful to use these musical forms in worship, not because they are intrinsically sinful, but because they are all part and parcel of a totally sinful culture. Therefore it is wrong, and it is deeply offensive to God to bring them in to his worship. I'm going to turn you to some well-known scriptures and just read them to you rather than expound them. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. Love not the world, the command of God, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. What is intrinsically and essentially worldly shouldn't be in the life of the Christian at all, and particularly not in his worship. And then the letter of James, chapter 4 and verse 4. Ye adulterers and adulteresses. This does not refer to people who are committing the literal sin of adultery. This refers to people who are committing a spiritual sin of adultery by mixing the world and the church together. In many scriptures, if a Christian weds himself to or involves himself in things that are intrinsically worldly and profane, he is committing spiritual adultery. He is doing in the spiritual realm the equivalent of committing physical adultery in the physical realm, only something which is infinitely worse. Verse 4, ye adulterers, adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Well, you couldn't have more powerful language than that. We are saying that the new worship is not only theologically inappropriate, incorrect, and an abandonment of principle, it is bringing the people of God to sin. It is intrinsically sinful and disobedient to God to the extent that the person who indulges makes himself an opponent of God and his precious will for the church of Jesus Christ. That is why these things are so important and so significant. Now our forebears knew it. Right up until the time when I was a youngster, these things were openly taught. All this was well known and affirmed. Our forebears would have avoided anything which fringed into the world of free sex, godlessness, drugs, and everything else. Without any doubt, there are two worlds for them. We'll be talking about this in School of Theology. The holy and the high, the kingdom of God, and the debased and the decadent, the kingdom of this fallen world. What a tragedy. Before the 1960s, all churches, more or less, practically all churches thought this way. Whether they were evangelical Anglican, whether they were Baptist or Methodist or free churches or congregational churches, if they were true believers, everybody thought this way. Around the world, on the mission field, in Nigeria and in all African countries, the true believers sang the old hymns. You know, they didn't have the tom-toms in and the drums and things like that. People say to me today, how can you talk about this? Why, in some world cultures, you've got to worship this way. In Africa, you'd have to have the drums. Well, they didn't. In Africa, for generations, as Christians were converted, they put it all away and they said, that is of the world. That is a debased culture. We are now children of God. We are now in Christ. And you look at the old hymn books that were used in African countries, they were exactly the same as ours. The Methodist hymn book was there. The Anglican hymn books were there. The Free Church hymn books were there. And their services were exactly the same. You know, what went wrong began to go wrong the world over. As in the West, we were the first to fall in America, then in Britain, as many churches took up the new culture and the new worship, so they took that to the Far East, to Africa, to the Middle East, and wherever there were congregations, there were some that succumbed. So when people say to me today, but how can you speak like that? The African churches have always had to have the drums. It's their culture. I reply, you don't know what you're talking about. It isn't. They saw clearly for generations that is of the world. And they abandoned it, and we brought it back from the West. It isn't a cultural thing, this. It's a spiritual thing. It isn't a matter of taste. It's a matter of principles. And this is the tragedy of the day, that these things are no longer seen. Every church that was founded as the result of the preaching of the gospel, not only in the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century, but in the 20th century, right up until the 1960s, every church that was founded by gospel workers who believed that worship was special for God and must not have the world in it. Do you know what's happening today? Many of these churches that were built and built up by the blood, sweat and tears and the toil of people who firmly believe those things, people have got into them and have wrecked them and have ruined them and have in a sense stolen those buildings, stolen those facilities and subverted them to modern entertainment worship. These so-called modern Christian leaders and evangelists, or some of them, who cannot hold a candle to their forebears, who have nothing of their passion and their spirituality and their power and their gifts, who can work only by bringing the world into the church and entertaining people. They have wrecked countless churches, and they have stolen them from the things that they used to believe. The new worship is not only wrong, it's not only sinful, it's despicable. It's people who impose what they like irrespective of what they're stealing and what they're spoiling. And it's deceitful. I know people, they're not fit to be in the ministry. I know people who've brought this into their church gently by degrees. And when they first brought it in, they said, look, for the sake of the young people, we'll just have a song here and a modern song there. They knew what they were doing. Soften up the people, increase the number, then bring the instruments onto the platform. Then after a time, bring in the drums and everything else. They are men who have been extremely cunning, some of them, and they are not to be trusted. And I'm sorry to bring this note into what I really mean to be a talk on the basis of principles, but this is what is happening. And in many places, and in my view, those people are not fit to be ministers of Almighty God. And now they call us Pharisees. The many, many people who stand on the principles, they try to convince their people this is not a matter of principle. It's just that those people are mean-spirited. They don't want you to have what you'd like to have, and they won't adjust. Abraham was called out of his culture. And says the New Testament, these things were written for our learning. He was to be distinctive for the Lord. The children of Israel were brought out of their culture. They were even removed from foodstuffs, the foods of Egypt that they had eaten to some extent, though they were a poor people and enjoyed. Nothing wrong with those foods. But when they were given the beautiful manna, and they began to complain, we want to go back to the foods we were used to, God punished them. Because that was a lesson for them. You are to be a distinctive people. There wasn't anything even wrong with those former foods. But the lesson for us is we are to be distinctive and special to the Lord. Why, there's a passage in Ezekiel, and I'll read it to you from Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 26. And here's the judgment of God upon Israel. Listen to this. Doesn't this apply today? Her priests have violated my law and have profaned mine holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane. Neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean. I have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. That's what's happened today. we will have no difference between the worldly and the spiritual. And it's gone. And God is angry. We could ask some of these people, and there are genuine people caught up in all this, why are you doing this? Why do you want the guitars and the percussion and the trombone and the saxophone and the xylophone? Why do you want these things? How are they going to help you? Oh, this will commend us to the worldlings of today, to this present generation. This will convince them that we're the same as them, that they've got nothing to fear, that there isn't a big gap between the world and the church. That's why we want to do it. Well, that is to destroy God's distinction between what is worldly and what is spiritual, and to bring the profane into the worship of God. And that is offensive to him, and that is sinful. That's the reason why it's wanted, and that is a great tragedy. The additional principle, the fourth principle that I want briefly to touch upon, but towards the end of our next little session, will be the necessity of reverence in worship. Reverence has gone. The necessity of reverence. So don't forget these things. Spiritual, not aesthetic. Rational, not ecstatic. Sacred, not profane. And then reverent. These are the principles. We must have them in our minds. Not a matter of taste, not a matter of generation. Solid scriptural principles have to govern.